Southeastern Australia, stand up. You got an opportunity to see your guy compete in his UFC debut. We have Dana White's Contender Series contract winner, Phar. Jack Jenkins, the former Eternal Champ, makes the walk representing Australia, taking on Massachusetts' own Shainis, Don Shameless. Both guys looking for their respective UFC win number 1. And if you look at it for Shainis in his UFC debut, took that on a couple of weeks' notice, replaced Giga Chikadze against then number 12th ranked UFC featherweight Sodiq Yusuff. They went in there, plum clinch, and it was the knees of Yusuff to the body shots of Shainis. Yusuff was able to win out in the matchup. It was a giant step way too soon for Shainis.
I don't know if you guys know this, but Sodiq Yusuff's one of the best fighters at 145 pounds, which just so happens to be one of the best divisions in the UFC. So yeah, I would say that's a step too far into UFC debut. That's what I don't get sometimes. Like, UFC sometimes does a great job promoting their young fighters, and then other times doesn't whatsoever. And just for Don Shainis, and that's what I worry about. And I guess that was the original question I wanted to pose you. Are they just trying to build up Jack Jenkins with this matchup? And it sucks to say something like that. But for Don Shainis, he had a very short flash in the pan in his UFC debut. Got matched up against, like I said, one of the best fighters in the division.
Plus 700 underdog with Shainis.
Exactly. So not a lot of people were expecting Shainis to win. And now he's fighting a guy in his home country who has a lot of hype behind him, who is one of those flashy prospects that I think the UFC could promote quite well. I'm just worried that that's what this fight kind of falls into.
It really is a tough one for Shainis, and I mean, if you couple that with the fact that he hasn't been able to train at his, the gym that he's established himself at in Kansas City, or outside of Kansas City, he's gone back to Citadel Martial Arts in Boston, Lausanne's as well, so a good strength of training partner over there, good guys to get ready for making that trip over to Australia. You look at it for Shainis, I mean, he was a bit of an oddball coming into the UFC because he had a win in 2022 early on against UFC vet, 4-fight UFC vet Cody Pfister. He won the lightweight belt at FAC. Then he went over and fought with Cage Titans. He won a belt over there. He was their featherweight champ. And then he goes on and fights Sodiq Yusuff. For Don Shainis, you know him for one thing and one thing only. That man brings a storm in a lot of his fights, and he just marches forward. He throws hammers. His takedowns are powerful. He has really good, and I'm glad that, listen, Sanko seemed to talk about it going into the matchup. A lot of the commentators did. His sweeps off the bottom are great. The elevator sweeps for sure, especially the ones that he had against Pfister in that matchup. But you look at it for Shainis, he gets himself into compromising positions in a lot of his fights. And I listened to an interview that he did not that long ago. And this was one that, again, it was with James Lynch of All Access MMA. And this was a quotable from Shainis. I think cardio is going to play a big factor in this fight because I like to come out fast and hard. And come out sprinting. And see who lands first. I mean, that's a tough thing to say and then put into practice against a guy like Jack Jenkins. You're going to say, well, why? Jack Jenkins, in some of his fights, decides to go out pretty hard, but in the majority of his fights, he goes out there and takes a really slow approach to it, and it's not a bad slow. He's got great combinations. He lands to the body into the head. He's got a really good leg kick. It's just the fact that Jenkins is a very refined, cerebral type of fighter in a lot of these fights, and oh, by the way, he usually has a wrestling advantage in most of his fights as well.
And that's what I worry about with Shainis. Like you had mentioned, the over-aggressiveness is a positive against some guys. It really overwhelms them early in fights. But like what we saw in the Sodiq Yusuff fight, sometimes just jump into the fire that much faster than you originally have to. And I will be curious to see who goes for the first takedown attempt, because I think Jenkins has the advantage in the wrestling, but Shainis is in that weird boxing to wrestling range to where, hey, it is available. If he does find himself crashing into a lot of these engagements, he might find himself in more of a wrestling match than he had even decided. That's the thing about Jenkins, and I'm happy you brought it up. It can be a slow start sometimes, but it is more of a patient approach, I think, because once he is able to find his openings and land with his combinations, he's a pretty difficult fighter to deal with, and at 29, it is an interesting age to be making your UFC debut, because, especially at featherweight, not old for the division, I'm not saying by any means, but you are going to have to start fighting some pretty good fighters pretty early on in your career if you do want to rise up through the ranks fast, because, like we just said, like, Sodiq Yusuff is out there, and I feel like people completely forget about him all the time, but he's one of the better fighters in this division. There's like 20 guys outside of the rankings who could all probably have a really competitive fight with a guy like Yusuff, so I just think the featherweight division is as deep as any, so if Jenkins does want to become that kind of next top-tier Australian prospect, he has to get off to a fast start.
And I mean, for Jenkins, really good friend of Jimmy Crute. If you go to Crute's Instagram, he's wearing the Phar Jenkins shirts. He's really trying to boost them up, and he's been talking about him for a really long time. I was reading an article that the All-Star MMA did on Jenkins with some nice quotables from Crute, but if you look at Jenkins, I mean, 8 of his 10 wins are by finish. He's got a varied amount of finish. It's not like all of them are by submission. And the other nice thing that you do like to see out of it in totality is the fact that he's won 7 fights in a row, and out of his 2 losses, one of them they rematched, and in that fight he was able to go out there and get the finish win. He was a big favorite on Contender Series of -330 against Freddie Emiliano Linares, but in that one, he was able to just grind him right out. Going back and watching his fights with Eternal, he was able to go out there, wear on his opponents, really utilize a great boxing exchange. And you hate to compare prospects from similar countries, but there's a lot of similarities and familiarities between a guy like Jenkins, who's representing Victoria, to a guy like Perth's own Jack Della Maddalena in their boxing, in their well-roundedness. We haven't really seen Della deluge into his offensive wrestling in the UFC, but I do expect to see a little bit of it out of Jenkins. It's just the fact that Don Shainis at featherweight's normally going to be at a big height and reach disadvantage in this fight. 1 inch of height, 1 inch of reach at 5'6". So there's a really good shot on the underdog in Don Shainis in this one to overwhelm, to utilize his wrestling, some of those sweeps. He's got really sneaky jiu-jitsu, great ground and pound too out of Shainis.
How long's the flight from Boston to Australia? Like, I hope he gave himself a ton of time.
Boston, LA, LA.
That's about as far apart on the world, though, as you could get. Like, so for Shainis, hopefully he did give himself time to, like, really adjust the time and all that.
And Shainis did talk about it in that interview with James Lynch. Like, he took that fight on really short notice against Sadiq Youssef, and he said it was the worst weight cut he's ever had because at the start of the week, when he got the call, he was 170 pounds and he had to cut it to 146. So this one, it's planned. He's ready for it. No big deal there. This fight was announced by Team Iridium on October 31st. So these guys have known about this for a really long time. Look at the odds. Jenkins is about a 3-1 favorite in the matchup. We have a look at the Tapology votes, Matt. Surprised us there to you. I'm going to say over-under. The fans have been like insane polar opposites in some of these fights, but I will say over-under 85% Jenkins?
I'll say over, because like you said, they've been pretty one-sided.
Yeah, and it's way over. 728 total votes, 92% Jenkins, 23% by decision, 67% by knockout. For the 8% that have Shainis, 48% by decision, 33% by knockout. I'll go with Jack Jenkins. I don't necessarily love the line. I think he's a little bit more of a reserved fighter. Whether it's 3 rounds or 5 rounds, I would give him advantages in the longevity in these fights. Don Shainis is like Meatloaf, like way back when. Kid's a bat out of hell. And he really lets it all hang loose.
I still just think Jack Jenkins is the more refined product out of the two, and that's what I keep on going back to. And for that reason, I do have to pick Jack Jenkins in the matchup.
Both of us going with Jenkins in a fight at featherweight, his UFC debut. Some big-time fights on this card. 9 Australians on the list. We can't wait for it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it.